And thank you very much for inviting me to give a paper. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I've been at Murrayfield before for a conference in 2008, actually. It was I'm a criminologist. It was the European Criminology Society conference. It's a massive conference, over 1,000 delegates. And we actually had all of these rooms as of the big plenary session. So all the coffee room here and the President's room. And there was a stage right at the top end where I was talking down a room that I actually couldn't see the end of. I needed binoculars to see the end of. And also people were kind of walking up and down. It was a bit like an airport lounge, actually. Today I feel as though I need to be a hammerhead shark, so I have eyes on both sides of it. So I will probably speak to this bit of the room, but I want to encompass and make this inclusive for absolutely everybody. Okay, so the title of my paper this morning is Who or What Are Universities For? And that's a really big question. And in the paper, I want to offer some reflections on the communication and use of scientific knowledge in a political environment which I'm sure you would all agree is becoming increasingly characterised by high levels of uncertainty and contestation, certainly in the United Kingdom context, possibly also within the United States and possibly across many other European countries with the rise of populism. Now, the paper is going to take as its focus the interface between research and public policy, and I'm going to outline some of the challenges which I believe our turbulent political environment poses for the role and purpose of higher education, and in particular for contemporary modes of knowledge creation, knowledge curation and knowledge sharing. Now, it's going to be based on two dimensions of my role. So although Dominic has mentioned that I'm the director of the Futures Institute, I'm also a jobbing criminologist. And I want to actually focus most of what I want to say on lessons learned from the research that I do there. So I'm a researcher leading the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crime. It's a longitudinal programme of research. We have a cohort of 4,300 young people that we have been tracking since 1998. Not in a stalking kind of way, but in a sort of tracking their lives since 1998. And we've also got other dimensions to that work, looking at homelessness as well and transitions out of homelessness. And we're interested on the impacts of pathways into and out of crime on the health and well-being of people in early, middle and older age. So that's kind of one dimension of the work that I want to focus on today. And secondly, the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which has already been mentioned, which is this new institute for research, education and engagement, which is going to combine this radical interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity with co-production. And I'll talk a little bit more about that institute much later on in the paper. Now, I've actually chosen to frame this paper around a text. And this is the text, is Robert McFarland's The Old Ways. This is a book, I'd be familiar to some people in this audience, but not everyone. And it's an account of his journeying on the ancient tracks, the drove roads, the coffin roads, the holloways that cut through the landscape both across the United Kingdom, but also across Europe and across Africa. And this book is more than just a travelogue, because it is a meditation both on the human heart, but also in the ways in which we shape and in turn are shaped by the landscapes through which we move. For me, the book provides a touchstone against which to measure the journeys and complex pathways which researchers must navigate in order to bring their influence to bear on policy. Akin to McFarland, I'm going to argue that these journeys and the political landscapes which form their backdrop are gradually prompting shifts in the academic role from that of individual expert to co-producer. In McFarland's words, prompting shifts from familiar dispositions. Excuse me. What I'm also going to suggest is that the communication of complex research findings is most effective when it encompasses not just the written text. So I'm hoping I'm preaching to the converted here today, but it also encompasses things like pictures and performance. In McFarland's terms, when it encompasses signs, songs and stories which touch the heart as much as they touch the mind. Now, I've chosen to structure what I want to say around 3 of the McFarlands concepts. Firstly, discrepancies, as you can see here on the slide. I'm going to explore in a little more detail the political context of knowledge production and the challenges they pose for modes of research, communication and deployment of data. I'm then going to look at affinities and share with you some of the hard-won lessons from the Edinburgh study about influencing policy. And we have had policy influence now after a very hard fight. And in part 3, shifts from familiar dispositions, I'm going to examine the changing nature of knowledge co-production and co-design and their implications for communication, using the example of the Edinburgh Futures Institute and the project on transitions out of homelessness that was undertaken with a community partner in Edinburgh. The paper is going to then conclude with some reflections on who or what universities are for and come back to the McFarland book for some further questions and insight. So, part 1 then, discrepancies, the political context of knowledge production, deployment and uptake. Well, as many of you in this room will know, particularly those who come from the United Kingdom context, the quality of scientific evidence is increasingly being measured by its capacity to have impact in the wider world, including policy impact. This has been driven in the UK by the imperatives of research funding councils and the Research Excellence Framework, or the REF as it's known. And this is a periodic review process which assesses and ranks the quality of academic research across institutions of higher education. Now, as a matter of routine, funding applications for research must now include pathways to impact statements and identify a set of non-academic stakeholders, and impact case studies have become in themselves a very lucrative dimension of the Research Excellence Framework, because universities get research excellence grants on the basis of how well they do, and those research impact case studies generate quite a lot of money. Local and central government are also exerting further pressures on universities to become demonstrably engaged with their wider publics, including communities at home and abroad, with university research and innovation having a critical role to play in driving the economic growth and creating jobs. So universities are a core part of the knowledge economy and bring quite a great deal to the gross domestic product of a state. So it seems to me slightly ironic that just as the contribution of universities to the knowledge economy has become more visible, and just as academics have become more incentivised to reach out to other communities and to communicate with other communities, that research, and academic research in particular, and subject expertise has been increasingly debunked and treated with cynicism in the political and popular imagination. And this charge has been led by some very high-profile political figures, including Donald Trump and Michael Gove. And I love these 2 quotes from them. I absolutely love these 2 quotes. This goes to the heart of some of the difficulties that we're facing. First of all, Donald Trump, who said, the whole climate crisis is not only fake news, it's fake science. There is no climate crisis. There's weather and climate all around us, so why would we be worried about it? And in fact, carbon dioxide is the main building block of all life. Thank goodness he's leading the free world. And then Michael Gove, during the Brexit, I'm the first person to mention the B word today, the Brexit word. People of this country have had enough of experts. These institutions, and by these institutions what he meant was universities and, as he put it, organisations with acronyms, are a conspiracy of elites, distant and unaccountable. So that's kind of what's being said by the top of countries. This debunking of expertise is also being accompanied by arguably a loss of civility in public life, and a gradual debasing of the public sphere, facilitated, it has to be said, by new technologies. And some examples are here: trolls on social media, mass surveillance and commodification of identity that tech enables, the fog of information on the internet, the complexity of regulations and consents. How many of you ever read the terms and conditions that you glibly click? How many of you actually understand, or you probably do here, but how many people in the general public understand if you click on cookies, what that, that I accept them, what does that actually mean? And of course there's this very pernicious use of tech to probably disrupt electoral processes. So there's been this kind of debasing of the public realm. And as I've said on this slide, this is kind of one of my key messages, is that never has expert knowledge, synthesis and critical commentary been more needed, and never has it been so publicly devalued. However, it's not just what politicians say that is problematic for the legitimacy of research. It's also what they do that creates some of the biggest challenges for effective research engagement with policy. Now here I'm going to draw on findings from the Edinburgh study, and actually kind of a sort of over time, a kind of review, a critical review of policy making across all UK jurisdictions. And these are 7 tendencies which all governments do when they come into office. All governments do, and watch. You can watch what's happening down south with Boris Johnson's government in the UK as an example of this. But this is what governments do, and this is what it makes these very dynamics, these 7 dynamics I've got here, make it extraordinarily difficult for researchers to gain purchase within the policy process. Because first of all, it creates a great deal of churn. So what governments do is differentiation from the past. They come into office, they cut everything off, they want to do everything new. So there's always that kind of churn when governments change. There's construction of new or revised institutional architecture. So they tend to create new institutions or new structures and add them onto existing structures. Then there is this selecting of new audiences, groups to whom policy speaks. So sometimes in my field, policymakers will talk to the failing parents out there, or the at-risk children, or the persistent offender, or the victim of crime. And down south in England and Wales and the UK more generally, there is a lot of talk to the 52% who voted to leave the European Union, and not very much talk to the 48% who decided they wanted to remain. So they choose and then reconstruct and nurture certain audiences. There's always the introduction of greater complexity to policy, so they add things on, they tend not to take things away. And politicians tend, and governments tend to seek research evidence to support what has already been decided. So it's looking, therefore, for confirmation rather than insight. And even when politicians say they're looking for insight, what they're really looking for is confirmation. So if your findings happen to coincide with what policymakers want to do, you're going to have influence. And if they don't, you're going to get shut out. And then there's this phenomenon called looping, which is where politicians represent older narratives of something new and distinctive. And I've got an example of that I'm going to show you in a minute. And finally, when political power is waning or weak, politicians, governments tend to focus on the emotive and the exclusionary. And that's why law and order generally comes to the fore in government discourse when governments are losing legitimacy or feel that they are weak and need to re-establish their power. So they construct anxieties about real or imagined enemies as a way of reinforcing social solidarity. So I've just got a couple of examples. And I want to show you, first of all, that we have a competition in the law school at the university to have the worst visual aid, and this is my contribution to it. But actually, it says something in its own right because it is so difficult. This is after we had devolution in Scotland, we had a Liberal Democratic and Labour coalition government, and they came to office with a very strong punitive law and order agenda, trying to gain public support. And what they did was to create over 100 new institutions to deal with a supposed rise in crime, when all the evidence showed that crime was either falling or was actually stabilising. That's what all the indicators suggested. But they created this institutional framework. And I tried to map it on one slide, and I gave up because I couldn't get every single new institution on, nor could I actually show the relationships. The lines show the relationships between them. I couldn't get them on. It would become like a network of lines and not any infrastructure. So that's what the government did. And then in 2007, when the SNP took office, a new government in Scotland, they kind of rearranged some of this and got rid of some of this and centralised some of this. So there's been this focus on architecture building and then changing that architecture. And then this notion of looping and presenting the old as new. I really like this. This is what I found. So I was working in government at the time that Malcolm Rifkin was making his first speech. That's on the left-hand side of this slide. He was a Secretary of State for Scotland. And 27 years later, a new Secretary of State, new Cabinet Secretary for Justice in Scotland, Michael Matheson, the civil servants has obviously dusted off the same speech and kind of updated it. And so you see that they're trying to say the same things, but one is they're both being presented as visionary. So that Malcolm Rifkin in 1998 on the left-hand side saying prisons are expensive to build and run and don't provide the ideal environment in which to teach an offender how to live a normal law-abiding life, to work at a job or maintain a family. Updated for 2015, short-term prison sentences don't work in terms of rehabilitation or reducing the risk of their reoffending. They disrupt families and communities, affect employment opportunities and stable housing. In 1988, Malcolm Rifkin goes on, perhaps some of these offenders could be dealt with by a community-based disposal, supposing that it is sufficiently firm and robust. And Michael Matheson, 27 years later, this new vision of Michael Matheson, this is why my vision is one where there is stronger emphasis on robust community sentences. So what happens is you get this kind of taking older ideas, representing them as new. And that creates a great deal of difficulty for researchers who want to kind of get impact and integration into the policy process. So lots of churn and lots of complexities. But actually adding to that, there's one other thing about the research policy interface that is confounding, and that is the working cultures of the institutions which make up, in this case, the criminal justice system, but in other cases, institutions set up to implement policy, that their working cultures also confound research into policy. And I've got just one example here from criminal justice, but what we see from Edinburgh study findings studying the decision-making practices of institutions over 21 years and looking at how they affect the lives of the cohort at different ages, what we see that in contrast to the transformations and ruptures in policy discourse, that the decision-making practices of institutions implementing policy actually exhibit a high level of continuity over time. And these continuities result in a degree of institutional inertia as their practices lag significantly behind policy imperatives. So there is no linear cause and effect model of research into policy and policy into practice. And that's something that we need to recognise and critically engage with. This slide just shows you three different policy eras, shows three different policy eras in Scotland. At age 11, when our cohort were age 11, there was a welfarist focus. When they were age 15, it was a much more punitive focus in policy. And at age 22, there was a much greater focus on early and effective intervention, EEI, one of Michael Gove's acronyms there, prevention and diversion. And what we see is that each time that the same things are considered in decisions to warn and charge. So lower socioeconomic status, family background, so poor kids get charged and warned by the police more than affluent kids. And previous form, if you're known to the police in previous years, then you're much more likely to be warned or charged, even though your offending may be less serious. So these things continue to be the drivers of decision-making, even when policy changes and even when policy is expecting the police and others to act differently. So we have quite a lot of evidence about that continuity. So the implications of this in terms of research policy interface is that there are potentially multiple sites and levels of engagement through politicians and institutions, that there are potentially multiple points of entry into discussion and debate. But this twin dynamics of churn and disruption for policymakers and continuities and inertia in terms of institutions and the loss of trust in expert knowledge mean that the real influence and the reach of our academic research is likely to be very constrained, and you have to work extremely hard to have any kind of impact at all. So those are the challenges which research faces in terms of trying to get traction in policy. How can we overcome them? Well, let me move on quickly then to part 2 and our affinities and the hard-won lessons from the Edinburgh study in trying to evolve dissemination practices that actually do have policy influence. So, sorry, I'm just losing my voice. I don't know why. Sorry. Okay. It's fine. So, Edinburgh study findings, our findings are very challenging for policymakers because they suggest that the key to reducing crime lies well away from the criminal justice system, and actually diverting people from criminal justice is much more effective than keeping them in systems, and tackling poverty and promoting educational inclusion are absolutely key. So it's taking things away from criminal justice, putting them into more social justice and educational justice interventions. Punishment doesn't work, and that's what politicians don't like to hear. But these findings have actually now had traction in policy circles. But as I've been saying, this has been incredibly hard won. From a time in 2003 when the Minister, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, stood up and said, when presented with our findings, "I don't care." Those were her actual words, "I don't care." So at that time we were not being listened to at all, to now where our findings have influenced this whole system approach and a diversionary approach that the Scottish Government is embracing. And this has led to major reductions in the number of young people who are coming into the criminal justice system, including a 60% reduction in youth custody rates. And I think that's one of the single most proud things about my career that I've ever had, this notion that Susan McVie and I have influenced policy, and that policy has had that very positive effect. And that's been a hard-fought battle. So how did we do it, and what were the kind of tactics that we used? Well, in keeping with sort of Robert McFarland's landscape thing, we got some extremely good advice from Baroness Vivian Stern when you were thinking about policy, and it's kind of like a landscape here. She says, think of policy as this river, a very fast-flowing river. If you try to jump straight into that river, you're going to get drowned or get shoved off with other flotsam and jetsam. Your challenge is to find the tributaries that flow into that river. So start with the tributaries and hope that you then move into that river. So there are multiple things that we have to do constantly and all the time. Campaigning with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, the Scottish Children's Commissioner, with the Scottish Child Law Centre. So lots of campaigning, actually academic activism. Engagement, reaching out and taking findings and trying to have connection, trying to have conversations, trying to do presentations with local and national government, with agencies, with practitioners and young people. Being responsive to requests for data and analysis constantly, and then looking beyond social science for methods of generating impact through pictures, stories and performance, and even stand-up. I'm going to talk about that in a second. What I want to share with you are 4 key modes of communication which actually shifted and disrupted policy and practitioner thinking. So there are 4 things that we did that we think had that kind of moment, a critical juncture, where our ideas and thoughts that came from the research findings, the research evidence, actually got traction in people's thinking. So the first of these is the killer graph. So everybody expects quantitative research to have the killer graph. We've got killer graphs here, the killer graphs. Now, technically, a killer graph should actually be self-explanatory and shouldn't need to be explained. But actually our findings are quite complicated, and therefore any kind of graph will always need some sort of explanation. And what the point of these graphs is to show is to demonstrate something that at first sight seems counterintuitive. That what these graphs are meant to demonstrate is that young people who get involved in high levels of serious offending are not always caught up in the criminal justice system, and that serious offending does not always indicate who is going to be involved with criminal justice over the longer term. That there is a disjuncture between criminal justice careers and self-reported offending careers. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see the first graph figure. That is showing the probability of conviction over time. And we've got 4 groups that are demonstrated there. A group along the bottom, that are no convictions. 2 early onset groups who started getting convictions around about the age 8 or 9. 1 group which went on to have a chronic conviction pathway, that red group, and 1 blue group that went on to then have a diminishing and then stopping pattern of conviction by their early 20s, so early desisters, and then a green later onset group. The figure on the right-hand side is showing the self-reported serious offending of both of those early onset groups. Now, what this demonstrates is if your behaviour was driving the conviction pattern, so if crime was driving the conviction patterns, you would expect the graph on the right to have different lines. But in fact, what we find is the 2 early onset groups have exactly the same kinds of self-reported offending. There is no difference between the groups, yet one group goes on to have a very chronic conviction pathway and the other has a diminishing conviction pathway. The key difference between those groups at age 12 to 13 is that the groups in the red line were excluded from school and the groups in the blue line were not. And so it's school exclusion that seems to be driving those pathways. So that was something that was counterfactual, difficult to absorb, and we tried to demonstrate it with some simple-ish graphs. The second mode of communication that was a disruptor is the killer picture. So this is where data visualization and geographic information systems are absolutely wonderful, because they are immediately understandable. And here we have this is Edinburgh City. And the darker areas in this map here are areas of high deprivation, areas that have been significantly socially deprived actually for decades. It's based on census data. And when we started loading onto this other dimensions of difficulty and challenge for young people, we found that they tended to cluster in these areas. So you demonstrate this social deprivation. And if you look at that kind of pentagon shape in that map, it's represented in all of these maps to come. So police recorded violent crime tends to cluster in those areas. The incivilities observed by our cohort, that's things like burnt out cars, vandalism, graffiti, needles in the street, again a bit more dispersed, but that pentagon shape is still visible. Then I've done a slightly Blue Peter job with this one. I've just stuck school exclusion blobs onto this map, but that shows you that in the areas of highest poverty there are greater levels of school exclusion. And finally, the young people who ended up in prison in our study, the vast majority of them came from the most deprived areas. So there is a strong relationship between poverty and many difficult outcomes for young people. And that kind of map is a very easy way of demonstrating it. And thirdly, moving on, and actually much the most powerful thing we've ever done is the killer story. So with quantitative data, you often generally provide aggregated data and you provide numbers and graphs and figures. But actually what quantitative studies also need to do is to develop stories from their data, stories of people from their data, that somehow seems to sort of capture the imagination. And I've just written a whole load of things about Doreen. So I call her Doreen after one of my aunties, actually. So Doreen is a very interesting story that she starts off in our data. We have data about her from what the agencies know about her and what we know about her. So we have official records, information about her, and we have also what she has told us herself. And what we see in her life, she ends up in prison by age 24, is a disjuncture between what agencies know and what we know. And what you see with her is she starts off as someone who comes to the attention of agencies as someone who is experiencing parental neglect. But actually she's also suffering from sexual abuse, but they don't know that. The agencies don't know that, but we know that. So she is having a very difficult time at home, and the agencies put her in and out of foster care, not understanding that she's being sexually abused in the home environment. And in the agency record, she starts off as this victim and gradually morphs into an offender and a difficult person, a dangerous person, according to the agencies, in her mid-teenage years. She's been excluded from school. She's been very socially isolated. She's made several attempts to kill herself, serious attempts to kill herself. She has a history of depression. So we have this timeline of Doreen. We have what agencies know and what we know. So in terms of trying to then convey this data to the wider public and also to policymakers, we decided to do something different with it, and we worked with the Scottish Storytelling Centre to create a performance around Doreen's story. So we gave the storytellers the timeline, and then we let them go and do what they liked with it. And actually what they came up with was the story of Rapunzel, focusing on key episodes in her life, and they gave voice to Doreen through this imaginary monologue and dialogue. And we gave this to the Justice Leaders Network in Scotland, which is all top lawyers, top judges, the Chief Constable of Scotland, top civil servants. We did it there once with the Storytelling Centre, and we also did it with academics and the wider public in a different location. And what was really interesting was a complete disjuncture in terms of how it was received. It was the Justice Leaders Network, you could have heard a pin drop. It was the most powerful thing, they said, that they had ever done at the network. I was worried they might find it a bit patronising because it began as this fairy tale. But it was the most powerful thing we have ever done, they said. And it's now, this Doreen story has been used in training, it's been used in rethinking prosecutorial practice, so it's had real grip. Academics did not receive it quite so kindly. One academic, I've got a quote here, I hate it, I absolutely hate it, she said. She really hated it. And part of that, I think, was about the fact that we were treating in a qualitative way quantitative data, so that was problematic for her. But also this sense that this storyteller was Doreen, and somehow or other that was an authentic voice of Doreen, when of course it wasn't an authentic voice of Doreen, it was an imaginary voice of Doreen. So there are kind of ethical issues that we have to kind of work through. But it was enormously effective. You can't do it all the time. It had novelty value. So you need to be quite kind of strategic about when you might invoke that kind of practice. And finally, because I'm going to be running out of time in a minute, very quickly, Susan McVie and I have also done stand-up comedy. I can't believe we've actually done this. In the Cabaret of Dangerous Ideas, in the Fringe. This is much more about public engagement, trying to kind of challenge people's preconceptions. We had, I don't know if you were there, possibly not, Hug a Thug, Hugging Thugs, Hug More Thugs. I've got 5 more minutes, I'm okay. Hug More Thugs. We are thinking about redoing this show next summer. It's in the Fringe. And lots of audience participation, and we tried to recreate a prison within this venue and get people to experience the sights, sounds and even smells of prison. It was quite fun, but frankly it's the most terrifying thing I have ever done. And Susan and I stood in the green room, actually it was a cupboard, beforehand the last time round, and both felt physically sick about doing this. But on the other hand, it's kind of quite a challenge for academics to do this, and it does get grip with audiences. You can use humour in a way of sometimes talking about quite tragic things, but you can use humour to have traction. So finally then on to my final part, and shifts from my familiar dispositions and the nature and importance of co-production. I started by saying that I thought that in order to have greater policy influence, there's actually a need to develop more democratic modes of engagement. And this, I think, has implications for the way and methods by which research itself is conducted. It's not just about how it is disseminated, it's actually about how we conduct it. And one of the ways that we're trying to do this at the University of Edinburgh is through this Edinburgh Futures Institute that Dominic was giving a kind of quick overview in my introduction for. And the key thing about the Edinburgh Futures Institute is mostly about its approach. And this approach is going to be about radical interdisciplinarity, recognising that the problems that humanity is facing across the world require multidisciplinary responses, radical multidisciplinary, can't say it, disciplinary responses from across the university, but also genuine co-production, working in a much more democratic fashion with external partners, with industry, with government and also with the wider community. And it's that co-production thing that we want to be the heart of our ethos, a participatory ethos, and it's going to be enormously challenging. And I want to finish today by actually talking about a much smaller scale aspect of co-production, an example of co-production that I've been involved in, part of the Edinburgh study, and it's this study on transitions out of homelessness, because I think this can tell you something about the value of co-production, but also maybe some of its challenges. So a very final example here. And this is the journey. It's in the Robert McFarland notion, the journey out of homelessness. And what we dubbed making the minister cry. That was the story that we wanted to try and make the minister who was going to be at this performance cry. This study of homelessness was undertaken in partnership with the Grassmarket Project, which is about offering services and support to people at deep risk of social exclusion and at risk of being homeless. And we did different dimensions of this study. There was interviewing, there was a photography project, but there was this drama project at its heart, which I undertook with a drama artist. So we were offered the chance to put on a performance for the minister, John Swinney at that time in Scotland, the Deputy First Minister, a performance when they were opening a new building. So that's what we worked towards, and it was a chance, a really important chance to get real voices, the real voices of people who experience real hardship, and get ministers to listen to them. So that's why the drama was really, really important. So we dubbed this, we wanted to make him cry, we wanted to touch his heart. So I worked for 10 weeks with this drama artist who had experience in supporting people with mental health issues and learning difficulties. And over that whole time period, we explored different aspects of each other's lives, including my own life. So when you become immersed in this project, you also, for all sorts of reasons, importantly trust, you have to take part too. So what we did, we took on roles as actor or director, and you could direct scenes from your own life. Much of the material that we covered was not included in the final performance, which focused on very positive asset-based things, and not everyone wanted to take part in it. So consequently, the process of co-construction over 10 weeks was actually really important in terms of data gathering. If you're using this as a research moment, that co-construction of the drama is where the data emerges, not the final output. And we explored things like bereavement. We explored things about fathers either absent or violent. Someone described being homeless as being locked in a dark place. There was an imminence of crisis in all these people's lives. They were kind of keeping it together, but one tiny thing going would absolutely collapse the whole thing. So that was a very powerful way of gaining insight and gaining data. How you record it is a challenge in itself. It was extremely challenging to do. There were points when I wished I'd never started it and was concerned, when we were discussing things of extreme vulnerability and extreme crisis. It was emotional, it was emotive, it was also exhilarating, and it was also lots of fun. So it was kind of a really emotional roller coaster. And we did put that drama on. I don't know if John Swinney did cry, but one of the women in this project who was terrified of getting up on the stage at the start stood on the stage at the end, and in front of 200 people, of ministers, the great and the good, local councillors, she said, "I'm proud of myself." And that for me was one of the most important pride moments of my own career. I was certainly in tears, even if John Swinney wasn't. The challenge, though, of that co-productive moment is how do you sustain that moment of empowerment? That person is empowered by standing on that stage. Research is a fleeting moment of someone's life. So how do we, as an institution, how do we in Edinburgh Futures Institute ensure that co-production has meaningful and long-term consequences? So on then to some concluding thoughts about all of this stuff. Well, the turbulent political environment in which research is conducted and its sometimes pernicious impact on the status and legitimacy of the academic voice highlights the need for me for universities to exhibit greater civic leadership, building more effective collaboration and offering critical friendship to governments, to industry and to our wider publics. And by way of concluding, I'm just going to come back to the old ways. This is my final slide, and Robert McFarlane. In his final chapter of the book, he describes a walk along this wonderful place near Liverpool called Formby Silts. And sands here have been washed away over time, and there are hundreds of prehistoric footprints of prehistoric people. And he walks imprint to imprint with these. So he takes a walk along these footprints. And he says this: "I stopped by the last footprint 5,000 years after setting out, my track ceasing where his does. I look back along the track line to my south. The light tilts again, and suddenly the water-filled footprints are mirrors reflecting the sky, the shuddering clouds, and whoever looks into them." I'm going to leave you with two questions, not answers, but questions for you. And these questions relate to the higher purpose of knowledge production and our respective roles and responsibilities in bringing research evidence to bear on the challenges which humanity faces. 5,000 years from now, what will our imprint have been? And who, if anyone, will be walking with us? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. So we've got a couple of people with microphones, Nick and Greer. So take this gentleman here.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I work on qualitative data, so I'm very happy that stories work for you. But I'm also worried about stories and politics. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how to distinguish a valid research-based story from the horrific stories that we've seen, like from the US context. I think of Welfare Queens and Will Horton, and I'm sure here you have your local equivalents that you can easily abuse. And how do you distinguish between a valid research-based story and a demagogic anecdote?
Yeah. Well, so how do you distinguish? Well, one hopes that there is research evidence that underpins the valid research story as opposed to the sort of the demagoguery. And I think so part of that is about how we conduct ourselves as academics and how much we want to get into debates and challenge. That's one thing that's really important. And I think that the difficulty with stories that go around in the internet is sometimes that people don't know enough about what is valid story, what isn't a valid story. So that requires academics actually to be much more communicative and much more willing to challenge and much more willing to stand up and say fake news, and this is the real evidence. And that is the requirement then of people to want to really step outside their ivory tower and get involved in these debates. Now that is quite a scary place sometimes, and particularly I've had colleagues who've had real abuse on social media. I have also had, when you see newspapers which have commentary sections, I've also been subject to abuse. Susan McVie and I, the nicest thing we've ever been called is do-gooders. We've been called an awful lot worse. But you've got to be prepared to have that kind of thing and challenge. And I think that I think is because there's so much information available, because there's so much information in the public sphere, that academics need to get out there, I think, and they need to be activists and they need to be challenging. So for me, that is about communication and actually taking on these stories and saying, no, this is not true. These are better facts for you. This is better evidence. So I think that's it's about communication and the willingness to go out and actually get involved in debate. Not straightforward.
Any questions? We've got time for one more question.
Communication. Sorry. Where do dissemination stops and where do communication starts? Because academics do not rely or should rely more on social media or not, maybe?
I think dissemination can't happen without communication. So communication is actually the thing. Dissemination, as we call it, in terms of how that might work for academic output, is one thing. But communication with audiences is a slightly different thing, in the sense that dissemination, that the audience for a lot of academic work is obviously other academics. Other academics consume, and actually you get status through how other academics consume your knowledge production. Where communication goes is where the communication is really, you have to communicate at conferences, obviously, and get your findings across. But there is also this thing about this outreach and actually talking to other groups and other communities. That's going to become much more and more important, I think, for universities. I think that universities have to be communicating and building relationships with and challenging other groups. So local communities, people who work in business and industry in the areas, governments, tech companies, in transnational organisations. And this is what I think that universities now are at a really critical moment. They have the opportunity to provide massive leadership in the context of all this turbulence that we're in. And I don't know always that they actually have the confidence to do that. Have the confidence to stand up and say, yes, there's a climate crisis. They have the confidence to stand up and say, President Trump is talking through his, we're respectful here.
I think we probably need to wrap it up there. We could just thank her.